Why bother? The game is rigged. The choices are terrible. Voting is for suckers. You, probably like everyone else, have heard some people saying some of these things before, and they wouldn't be wrong. In many places today, voting is rigged in many ways. So should we vote? To all those who say yes, why? It's true that democracy is based around an idea of equal representation. So when someone opts out of voting, a society isn't really democratic. Voting can increase our individualism by allowing us to be part of the decisions being made in our respective regions. People need to start understanding that elections do have consequences and voting is extremely important. Michelle Obama once said, "Voting can feel like the furthest thing from your mind, but that's exactly what some people want you to think. The truth is, when we stay home, things get the same or worse." People need to understand that elections do have consequences. Not voting is what causes incompetent leaders to ascend to power. So, should we vote? Obviously, we hear the usual excuses of why people don't vote that I just referred to. But does that really mean that we should give up on the democratic process? Another excuse people give is that none of the frontrunners resonate with them and they can't connect to any of the candidates. So they don't vote. And the party they hated the most wins. Not voting is voting for someone you didn't pick. People our age just don't seem to care about voting. Among people aged 18 to 24, 30% weren't interested in voting, while another 23% were too busy. This means that over 50% of people don't really care about our democratic process. This is a really scary statistic because more than half the country is being controlled by the other. So how do we fix this? First of all, who should vote? Should everyone get to vote? Should voting be mandatory? If we were all forced to vote, would elections really be fair? If I just pick someone off the list of candidates, does that really count as a vote? Another argument people give is that their district has never changed sides and probably never will, so their vote doesn't really count. But do our votes count? Statistically, there is a 1 in 10 million chance of breaking a tie. But if everyone has that mindset, there won't be a tie to break. So if we don't agree with any of the candidates, should we abstain? Should we vote strategically or sincerely? Let's say you're voting in an election. Do you A, pick the candidate that aligns the most with your beliefs, or the candidate that aligns both with your beliefs and has a good chance of winning? If you pick the second one, you're probably a strategic voter. Let's define these terms. Strategic voters are people who don't always vote for their favorite party or candidate. They vote to maximize their influence on the outcome of an election. They're the opposite of sincere voters, people who only vote for their favorite party or candidate that aligns most with their beliefs. So which one is better? This is all based on your priorities. What matters to you and why? Obviously, one way to make a decision is to look at the repercussions of it. Do we want a candidate that's good for the world, or do we want a candidate good for my bank account? Do we change our economic system to make it sustainable, or do we continue with the status quo? There needs to be a line between ethics and money. And if one can find that line for them, they can make efficient, effective decisions. But finding that balance is in no way easy. This is a political graph. This one's quite complicated, so I'm going to simplify it down a bit. Finding where you are on this graph will allow you to come to a conclusion about yourself. If you're further to the top on the graph, you might prefer more government influence. If you're closer to the bottom, you might prefer a more individual-based and private society. If you're on the left, you might prefer large-scale changes and lots of issues on actions such as climate change. If you're closer to the right, you might prefer keeping things the same and focusing on the economy. So how do you pick one? How does one weigh the needs of a climate versus an economy? When asking these questions, one must ask themselves, what matters? What is life about? And who am I? Answering these questions will allow you to come to a conclusion about yourself. And there is no one answer to this question. And the answer you may have now will change. And the same goes for your political views. Another thing we here in the Western world have to consider is our bias. When we criticize others for doing things we see as wrong. Take the country of Brazil, for example. Their president, Jair Bolsonaro, did not condemn the burning of the Amazon. In fact, he may have supported it. All of us here in the Western world were so appalled by these decisions, we never really took the time to determine why this was happening. 50% of Brazilians live in extreme poverty. Most of these fires were started by people trying to make a living for themselves or their families. One thing we here in developed countries have to understand is that if we want to criticize, we have to provide effective solutions to these issues. In Brazil, people can't afford to help the climate because they're too busy trying to feed their families. We can vote more liberally because we have privilege and we can afford to. You may think that this only happens in the developing world. However, that's simply not the case. It happens everywhere, including here, but we just don't take the time to see it. Another way to make a decision is looking at the consequences of it. There is obviously no one way to know exactly what the repercussions of a decision might be, but we can look at past instances. The example we see the most right now is in the COVID-19 pandemic. The pandemic is an ideal situation of consequences because it puts the strength of various institutions on display. Take healthcare, for example. Healthcare systems that were strong were able to cope with surges of patients and save as many people as possible. However, healthcare systems that were underfunded couldn't do this. They were unable to cope with the mountains of patients, and this resulted in many avoidable losses of life. Another example is education. During the pandemic, many regions went online. However, some couldn't afford to, resulting in many children being left behind. The disparities that actions may cause have to be considered when making a decision. The final and major point you have to ask yourself when voting is, what is success? What is enough for you? This is really a question of demand and consumption. How much do you want out of life? This isn't a one-way question, nor is it a one-way answer. Are countries making the right or wrong decisions? What do you want out of life? People really need to contemplate these decisions and discuss them with others. However, drowning out other voices won't help either. We need all voices, because if we don't have all voices, we won't recognize the issues that we're blind to. All perspectives are needed to determine that voting should not be a partisan issue. We are all on a quest for balance. Balancing the needs of our individuals with the needs of our communities, the good of our communities with the good of our country, and the good of our country with the good of the world. Voting is not something that can be taken lightly, and voting requires consultation, consensus, freedom, and legit rights, because the decisions you make today will determine the outlook of the future. Thank you.